Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Marcia McNutt, President of the National Academy of Sciences, and it's my pleasure to invite you to this special session on the situation in Ukraine for Ukrainian scientists as a part of the 159th annual meeting of the National Academy of Sciences. I'm joined today by three distinguished members of our Policy and Global Affairs Division: Dr. Vaughan Turekian, who is the executive director of PGA, Franklin Carrero-Martinez, who is senior director for sustainability within Policy and Global Affairs, and Rita Guenther, who is a senior program officer. The three of them have been doing much of the heavy lifting on this, and so you'll get a chance to hear from them directly. Allow me a few minutes just to set the stage. So earlier this year, the National Academy was approached by senior members of the State Department to think about ways that we might help address a potential displacement of Ukrainian scientists on account of pending war with Russia. The State Department came to the Academy to have this discussion because they were well aware of our previous efforts to help Afghan scientists who could be in grave danger because of their association with Western governments and with the US State Department in particular. By late February, it was incredibly clear that, yes, indeed, this invasion was happening and that scientists were moving. Many of the male scientists joined the fight to protect their homeland, but many of the women scientists and their children fled the country. We could not have anticipated, when we first had our discussion with the State Department, the scale of this mass movement. Last time I checked, it was more than 5 million people who have moved out of the Ukraine, and a significant, an appreciable fraction are scientists and their families. So we started thinking, we had been thinking about ways that we could help. So that, first of all, the scientists who had fled, we wanted to make sure that they could have a safe place to live, school for their children, continuing connection to the international scientific community, and the dignity of actually continuing to hold a scientific position. In addition, even for the men scientists, if they knew that their wives and children were safe, it would be a relief for them. So we created a partnership with the Polish Academy of Sciences. The partnership is for the purpose of funding short-term stays. The Polish Academy has been wonderful about finding positions in their research institutes for these displaced Ukrainians, while the National Academy of Sciences mounted its largest and fastest fundraising campaign in many years in order to provide stipends to these researchers. We are very grateful for all of the Academy members who stepped up when this call went out. Some individual members gave us $10,000 to help with this. We also had many foundations and other scientific organizations, such as the American Chemical Society. We got an amazing gift of $1 million from the Breakthrough Foundation. All of this has accumulated to a fund of about $3.5 million, which we are distributing to the Ukrainians scientists to make sure that they can continue their work. So now I would like to pass the podium over to Franklin, who's going to tell you a little bit more in details about our program.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you all. Good morning. My name is Franklin Carrero-Martinez. I'm a senior director within PGA. And I'd like to say that one of the first things when we started thinking about helping Afghans, having the support of Marcia was one of those key elements that allowed us to proceed and go in ways that the academies have not gone before. And directly helping scientists, fellow scientists, engineers, and medical professionals in need. Back in August, Vaughan and I were on our way to Rwanda, where we had successfully evacuated a few Afghans. We were going to meet them there. We created the program SEED. SEED stands for Scientists and Engineers in Exile or Displaced. The idea of SEED was to make sure that professionals, scientists, engineers, medical doctors, and others remain connected to their professions. We know how hard people work to get to that stage where they get a PhD, a master's degree, specialized training. We all know it takes about 20 years plus essentially the rest of our lives in additional training, going to conferences, reading papers, and all of that just to remain part of a vibrant community. And we know that when scientists leave the lab, the teaching room, and end up in a refugee camp or disconnected from their profession, it's very hard for them to go back. So the idea of the SEED program was, when we started it back in August, was to make sure that scientists remain connected in a dignified way to their professions. So we brought a few families that worked with us under the PEER program. It's a program that we run in the Division of Policy and Global Affairs under Vaughan. These scientists and engineers from Afghanistan, we felt, and they were communicating with us, that they were in danger because of their affiliation with this USAID program. The idea then and how we started running this program after the Afghans, and when we were contacted by the State Department and the White House, thinking about the impending Ukraine crisis, we quickly started working with the Polish Academy of Sciences. We set up a process. We wanted to make sure that we were not adding to the burden. We wanted to make sure that the reviews were streamlined. So we currently receive proposals from them. They have a collaboration, an MOU with the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. And that review we run here within our division. We have Ukrainian diaspora scientists helping us with a layer of the review, just to make sure that we have quality control, that we have credibility in the process, and that the funding that have been provided by you as members and the foundations that Marcia mentioned, we are being good stewards of those funding. We're currently placing scientists from a range of fields, but we're mostly focused on scientists from the physical sciences, chemical sciences, mathematical sciences, computing sciences, which are areas of significant strength in the Ukrainian scientific enterprise. We're currently looking for ways to better support graduate students. We know that the future of a healthy scientific enterprise in any country, in the US, and Ukraine is no exception, is to ensure that the next generation remains connected. And those are the ones that we worry the most because they are probably the ones that are at greater risks of not coming back. And we know that there are a number of them that are within Ukraine fighting the war. There's a few younger ones that have left the country, and we're in that process. So we'll be more than happy to hear from you on ways that we can support. We have created an email address, SEED, SEED @nas.edu. You can reach out to us there, and we'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you, Marcia.
Unmute myself. Thank you very much, Franklin. Very helpful information. Vaughan, let's put you up next.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you, Marcia. And as Franklin mentioned, thank you to you personally for supporting this, because I think that gave a lot of I think credibility to these efforts, but also critically to the Academy membership and to the foundations that have been critical in this. Let me actually dovetail off of something that Franklin mentioned about the graduate students, because last month Franklin and I had an opportunity to actually visit the region, going to Poland and then to the Baltic states to get a better handle of what was going on and to meet a number of our colleagues including the key members of the Polish Academy of Sciences who have been close colleagues on this. During that first visit to Warsaw, we had the opportunity to meet with a number, and as Marcia mentioned, mostly women. So we met about 20 of the women, and there were a few men over the age of 65 that were also being placed through this program, but the bulk were the women. And we had an opportunity to meet with them and to learn. They were maybe a week or two into their fellowships at the Polish Academy that we had been supporting, and really began to learn a lot about, as much as we could, their experiences and where they were. And one of the things that was quite clear is just the sheer appreciation they had for being able to come into Poland away from home and almost immediately get reinserted into their profession, to not be in a position where, as talked about before, they were refugees. So of course, the financial part, which is actually quite modest, is one thing. The ability to remain connected to their scientific fields and with colleagues, both in Poland, but also around Europe and around the world, was critical. What was interesting, and I don't think that and it builds on something Franklin said, that I don't think that we fully appreciate. Of course, they were deeply concerned about their family left behind in Ukraine. Oftentimes, they were their husbands, their brothers, their sons, their fathers, who were behind because the martial law in Ukraine around men between the ages of 18 and 65. But also in that age range, they were deeply concerned about the further training of their graduate students that were left behind. We had a number of them point out that they were, of course, terrified for their family, but deeply hurt and concerned about the future of their graduate students and their ability to remain in the training program and to stay connected. So we do continue to look, as Franklin mentioned, at ways that we might be able to work with the senior professors to help also keep them connected to their graduate students, either those in Poland who don't have placements or other parts of sort of Eastern Europe, but especially in Ukraine. Because we know the data. We know from 1991 to 2016, over 200,000 PhD scientists left Ukraine and went to Europe, the United States, and China and other places. That same type of brain drain, were it to continue, would be devastating, not just for science, but really for the broader economic recovery and future of a free and sovereign Ukraine. One of the things that's interesting when you go to Poland and particularly Warsaw is you get the feel of it being, and I sort of use hiking terms on this, of it being a base camp. It's the place from which a lot of preparation is taking of people moving out into Ukraine. And that's everything from the news services to clearly people that are trainers and other things to help the Ukrainians in country, and the massive numbers of people moving from Ukraine into Poland and therefore west. And you notice this because the Academy of Sciences building headquarters is actually right across from the main train station. And every time a train arrives from the east, it is filled with hundreds of women and children, often with a suitcase and a stuffed animal. And so that's the flow of people. In fact, while Franklin and I were there in our hotel, we actually ran into, and I say ran into because we literally ran into the security team for the foreign minister of Ukraine, who was visiting Poland and meeting with his colleagues from Poland and the Baltics to start preparing other things. So that's the sense there. Differently in the Baltics, whereas Poland feels much more like a place on the border with Ukraine and the conflict going on there, when we went to the Baltics, what was clear is two things. One is they view themselves much more as on the front lines of a potential war with Russia. They feel very vulnerable. Their location and their history as being part of the Soviet Union, whereas Poland was not as part of the Eastern Bloc, but not part of the Soviet Union, gives them much more of a sense of unease and even some of the threats that have come out more recently. And what you sense is that they also have a much better understanding of what Ukraine is going through in terms of what they're going to need to do to rebuild, because they too went from being a Soviet to a post-Soviet state, particularly in Estonia, that had to change their scientific system away from a more top-down Soviet model to a more distributed, I'd say, European model, in no small part to become connected more with the European Union, which again, if you look at the statements that are coming out of Ukraine, their desire is to become part of Europe. And that will have implications, obviously, on economy and everything else, but also will mean that their scientific systems themselves will have to be better integrated with Europe. And so there's a lot of really good lessons to learn and lots of expertise in the countries that have made or are in the process of making that transition. As we were talking to the Estonians, one of the things I mentioned is the United States is almost uniquely a bad exemplar for countries like this, because even though we're a very young country, we're a very old government. Our governmental system is actually quite old compared to those in the world. Whereas those countries in Eastern Europe that are 20, 30 years post-Soviet, they're going through these growing pains. They're seeing where there's opportunities and challenges. So we really do appreciate and look forward to working with the science communities in that country. So let me get to that. The last part of what I was going to say is this gets to the piece where even as we are focused, and appropriately so, on the urgency of now, of helping so many of these scientists coming out. And by the way, we've been joined by colleagues not only in Poland and the United States, but Marcia had discussions with colleagues in Denmark and the Danish Academy and foundations there that are interested. The Royal Society in the UK has also expressed a very strong interest in being engaged in this effort. We are also in the process now of working with the Ukrainian Academy, the Polish Academy, some of the senior Ukrainian science policy people and experts in the United States to begin to think through what does a rebuilding of Ukrainian science and engineering look like longer term. Not just the infrastructure part of it, but where are there areas of necessary investment? We can start imagining what those look like, but we want to hear from the Ukrainians too and have that conversation. So we've put together a working group that includes, as I mentioned, representatives from all the different sort of aspects of both Ukrainian, European, and US expertise and policy to begin looking at this so we can help advise not only Ukraine and the science communities in the US and elsewhere, but critically also knowing that, and having lived in the State Department for a period of time, there's always the effort to start thinking about what do donors conferences look like and how do we begin to mobilize the rebuilding. If the scientific community is not there and not thinking about this, then it's going to be a lost opportunity when there's going to be, I'd say, more effort to think through this. Finally, I'll mention we're very deeply interested in how to, as Franklin alluded to, how to begin to connect some of our early career researchers in the United States with the early career researchers still in Ukraine, particularly around some of these grand challenge spaces. And the Academies has a long history through things like the Frontiers programs of establishing this type of activity. We're making initial looks at what might happen if we were to establish a version of a Frontiers program, a US Ukraine or US Eastern Europe Frontiers program to really build those links, particularly around some of the key fields that are going to be critical, like agricultural biotechnology, mentions of physical sciences, others, where Ukraine's going to need to have the top talent going forward. I'll end by saying all of this is, of course, very precarious because while the war seems to have shifted east, we know that it's a country in conflict. And so one of the things I think we constantly have to do is understand and connect with what the various scenarios are and how that will affect the development of science in Ukraine, whether it's possible to think more broadly across Ukraine or whether we should start in those places we know are a little bit less vulnerable right now to an ongoing incursion, knowing that a lot of the scientists, particularly in the East, have had to displace West, particularly in places like Kharkiv and Sumy, where they've had to displace West. So sorry to go on so long, but look forward to this conversation. Marcia, back to you.
Okay, great. Rita, you're up. Give us your insight.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. McNutt, for the ability to participate in this panel, and thank you to those of you who are joining us. I'd like to provide a slightly different perspective on this unfortunate crisis that we're dealing with today, and that is our longstanding cooperation with our Russian scientists, and in particular through the Russian Academy of Sciences, initially with the Soviet Academy of Sciences. And I just would say 2 sentences of background. Many of you know this history, and many of you have participated in this history. And of course, Dr. McNutt's support, as well as that of her predecessors, has been critical in sustaining our engagement with our colleagues in Russia for so long. We first signed our inter-academy agreement in 1959, and then subsequently, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, we were able to continue much, very critical and much needed conversations on security issues, particularly around arms control, through a very unique mechanism of our academies that was begun in 1981, and that's called the Committee on International Security and Arms Control. And through these two long-standing mechanisms, we've developed decades of experience with grants, with infrastructure development inside of labs as they were upgraded following the end of the Soviet Union, across the former Soviet space, connecting scientists and experts to one another across not only the region, but importantly across what was the Iron Curtain, and really facilitate a lot of the engagement of science that really became global in Russia following the end of the Soviet Union. And currently, of course, the scientists who are, and engineers and medical experts who continue to work in Russia are facing increased challenges due to new laws that have been enacted in the Russian Federation regarding what President Vladimir Putin has called the special military operation in Ukraine. Further challenges to the scientific and technical community there include and the fact that discussions and statements made by the leaders of institutions, and universities may challenge individual scientists' ability to continue their work and cooperate with technical experts around the world. Another challenge that many face inside of the Russian Federation is how to continue their own scientific collaborations on an individual level with their colleagues around the world, particularly now that Russian passport holders are not allowed by the Russian Federation to participate in international scientific conferences. So we at the National Academy of Sciences are continuing to closely track and understand what is happening with our colleagues and with Russian scientists in general within the Russian Federation. And we are part of a larger cohort of peer organizations that are working to understand the challenges related to the continuance of science inside of Russia as well. And so as Vaughan mentioned, we are also thinking about how we can leverage the many decades of experience in the post-Soviet period to understand how those mechanisms that we developed can facilitate rapid efforts to aid our colleagues in Ukraine following the end of this war. So we hope that our long-term engagement in this region, not only in Ukraine, not only in the Russian Federation, but across that entire space of Europe, can be beneficial to all of our colleagues around the world, so that science, medicine, and engineering can continue to benefit the welfare of people all across their own countries and around the globe. We need their help, and there will come a time when even greater engagement and help from our side can really help all of us continue the scientific enterprise. So thank you very much. I look forward to continuing the conversation. And again, I can't thank Dr. McNutt enough for her support and that of her predecessors, because we could not have gotten from 1959 to here without a great deal of support. And certainly we can't go forward without her support and all of your support. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rita. Now I'd like to open this up for questions. For those of you who are joining us in the audience, there is a button on the website where you entered this discussion where you can submit questions. And I already have two, which I'm going to phrase a little differently just because more information has been said by the three of you since they came in. The first is from Trudy Shupak, who is asking about graduate students and postdocs. What do you see as the additional barriers in trying to support grad students and postdocs? Are they simply financial, or does it run deeper?
So a couple of things. It depends on where the postdocs are, the graduate students are. Part of the challenge is if they're in Ukraine, there is sort of the logistical difficulty that comes with them being in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Outside of Ukraine, I think I would say it's two things. One is really understanding who they are, and two, recognizing that most of those that are outside of Ukraine right now, not all, but most of them, as with many of the scientists, want to stay close to the region. That's where their families are still in many cases. So thinking creatively about what the opportunities are to develop more virtual or connected lab relationships would be good. but it will require us doing a much better understanding of who the graduate students are. And I think there's opportunity there, and we're working on that as well.
Thanks very much, Vaughan. Let me go on to the next question. This one is probably for Rita. Arthur Ogus writes, he's applauding these efforts, but what are the barriers to try to help Russian scientists who want to leave the country because they don't support what's happening? Is it simply the fact that they can't travel to a conference from which they could then enter another country, and so it's getting out of the country is the problem, or are there other issues we need to be worrying about?
Thank you very much for the question. The primary challenges are twofold. One, securing a position to go, to stay, and understanding how long a particular scientist might choose to stay away from Russia and the Russian scientific network that was built during their initial career. And unlike what is occurring in Ukraine, many Russian scientists or scientists who work in the Russian Federation may choose or need to stay abroad longer. So longer term solutions may be necessary, and that is difficult to secure, particularly on a short timeline. And it's also made more difficult because of some funding restrictions within the United States. There are some restrictions that are both individual at a university or institutional level, as well as funding with federal funds that prohibits funding for certain groups of people. And sometimes that includes Russian scientists. So figuring out how to find a placement that is potentially longer term and finding a way to fund those positions is a particularly unique challenge to Russian scientists who may choose to leave. And then the final thing I'll just note is that since even prior to the beginning of the war, our consular services in Moscow have been significantly dwindled due to several diplomatic issues going back for several years. This functionally means that no visas are currently being given inside of Russia by our US Embassy in Moscow. That requires a scientist and his or her family to actually leave Russia first to secure a visa to the United States. Many people are traveling to Tbilisi, Georgia, Yerevan, Armenia, and any of the Baltic states to try to then figure out how to move on to the United States or their final destination. So those are the primary challenges that we're experiencing today.
Great, thank you, Rita. So the next question is from Gerhard Wagner, and he points out that Ukraine has a first-rate pharmaceutical industry, and in particular that companies in the Ukraine are worldwide the best in providing small molecules for designing small molecules for inhibiting important drug targets. So his question is, could they publish a perspective piece in PNAS about this part of Ukrainian science and its international importance? And I can just take that question. I'd be happy to help make that happen. I think that the readers of PNAS, first of all, need to hear about the quality of the Ukrainian science and what is actually at risk. And the fact that this is one area where they are supplying important samples and important mechanisms for drug delivery to the entire world. So if you just want to drop me a note, Dr. Wagner, I'd be happy to work with them on such a thing. Okay, next question. The question is the Academy supporting Russian Federation scientists who are fleeing the country or being punished as dissidents? What's the status on that?
Would you like me to begin?
Why don't you go ahead, Rita? Sure.
Okay, thank you. Currently, the Academy is not directly supporting financially Russian scientists who are seeking to leave their home institutions and find their way to another institution in the United States. That said, we are, as I mentioned earlier, part of a larger network of peer organizations, and those peer organizations are providing support to Russian scientists, and also, I should say, a broader range of Russian experts, including those who are experts in the humanities and social sciences. So we are part of those conversations, but we currently do not financially support Russian experts who are choosing to leave Russia. With regard to engagement with specific Russian scientists, we do continue to maintain contacts with our colleagues inside of Russia, as well as those who have departed. And so we continue to maintain those personal connections and in specific cases, institutional connections as well. So I hope that answers the question. And of course,
so let me do just a quick follow-up on that. Sure. My recollection is that many of the dissidents who were arrested have now been released. Is that true, or are there scientists still being held against their will?
That is true. Many of them have been released, and I should note here to just remind all of us, for those of you who may know and share with all of you who don't, that the National Academy of Sciences has long supported a committee on human rights. And that Committee on Human Rights is an office inside of our academies, and they support quietly and investigate and pursue cases of scientists, medical professionals, engineers who are persecuted not just inside of the Russian Federation, but around the world, simply for doing their jobs. And so if there are Russian scientists who are in this precarious situation, and we find out about them through our networks on the Committee on Human Rights side, or if any of you know of any of those folks and would like to bring their cases to our attention, we will share them with our colleagues at the Committee on Human Rights, and they will investigate and pursue whatever can be done to bring attention to their case in a quiet way that can help them. And we have been doing this for years quietly, and we continue to do that. But as of right now, I don't know of any additional individual scientists who still remain in Russian custody as a result of doing their jobs. But again, we welcome those names so that we can be of assistance.
Thanks, Rita. Okay, this next question is, I'm going to give this one to Franklin. And it's from an email address I don't recognize, but it's from Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Research Center. And the person's asking, is only Poland involved? What about other neighboring countries which have taken in refugees from Ukraine?
Thank you very much, Marsha, for the question. So that's one of the things and one of the main reasons why Vaughan and I went to the region a couple of weeks ago. We started conversations with the Lithuanian Academy, with of course, we had the collaboration with the Polish Academy. We talked to the Latvian academies and the Estonian academies. We have, of course, contacts with other academies in the region. It's a matter of aligning processes. The number of scientists that have reached those countries remains smaller, and the greater need is in Poland. So we're just focusing in Poland for now, but we do know that the Polish Academy is reaching absorptive capacity. So we're in the process of expanding the collaboration to neighboring countries.
Right. Good. Thank you. So I was going to say also that when Vaughan was talking about the need to think longer term with these scientists and rebuilding the relationships, Ukrainian researchers already seemed to have a lot of colleagues that they were interacting with in Eastern Europe, but less so with the West, except for, a few specific fields. So it seems to me, given all that we've learned from the pandemic, about the ease of virtual convening, that this situation could be an opportunity to connect some of these Polish researchers with researchers in the US interested in similar problems and create a larger international pool of people for the Ukrainian scientists to collaborate with. It seems to me that this doesn't actually cost a lot of money. It's really more a matchmaking thing. Vaughan, do you want to comment on that?
No, that's exactly right, Marcia. And I think that's one of the things that in terms of our ability to draw on experiences, even over the last 3 years or 2.5 years, will be very valuable. I'll mention a couple of programs. One is the Department of Energy, and obviously a NAS member, Jerry Richmond, was at the garden party, and I had a chance to talk with her a little bit. The DOE now has a program that they will provide top-off funds to U.S. researchers that have Department of Energy grants to then fund either those researchers in Ukraine to come to the United States, but more commonly to fund the European university so that the Ukrainian researcher and the US researcher can be connected through that mechanism. And so I think looking at that as various matchmaking exercise would be quite good. We are hoping, and we're going to bring together a number of the other agencies that also have the ability to do this type of supplemental or top-off funding as a way to see if there's opportunities outside of just DOE. The second thing is, though, Marcia, I think the point that you make is exactly right. And an opportunity it really does focus then on an opportunity to think through the way in which we can do things more jointly with graduate students. So some sort of a joint training or joint supervising of graduate students between the Ukrainian researcher, either in Ukraine, easier if they're out, and in the United States. And so thinking through different options, or looking at things even like summer institutes or summer fellowships to get some of the graduate students to have an opportunity in a lab in Europe or the United States. So looking much more at this as a way to build on a remote collaboration that can also use it as to build out the graduate students and use graduate students as ways to build those broader links between lab to lab research.
Great, thank you. So we're getting near the end of our time. So I would like to give each of the panelists 2 minutes to just sum up what they think are next steps and how anyone viewing who wants to help can help. Rita, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Franklin and then Vaughan.
Sure. Thank you very much. I would just encourage all of us to continue to explore our own networks, but also our experience that we've developed over several decades that can allow the fast tracking, if you will, of the infrastructure of sending money, of creating programs, et cetera, because we have so many excellent mechanisms that if we utilize some of them, if they're relevant, then really we can go quite a bit faster in terms of helping our colleagues around the world. And I would just also encourage us to keep our ears to the ground so that as we hear of developments, we share them with one another so that we can learn more expeditiously and try to craft our assistance and our collaborations in ways that can really build upon one another in a very dynamic environment. And then as we do that, it can provide insights into this longer term challenge that we will face, not only in Ukraine, in the Russian Federation, but across that entire region that is impacted quite significantly by these unfortunate events. And the last thing I will say is that as we do think about science and working toward helping our scientific communities, I'd like to just note that we have a lot of mental health resources that we have been working on through the National Academies and across the institution, particularly with regard to trauma-informed care and trauma-informed decision-making. And that can be of assistance as we think about how we can help people in a holistic way, because of course, this is a tragedy that is affecting the whole person, including scientific careers. So Thank you all, and I look forward to remaining in touch on this critical issue.
Thanks, Rita. I think your point about the trauma, I'm sure other people saw last night on the news, the civilians that had been evacuated from the steel mill in Mariupol, and what the horrors they have gone through in the past few weeks. Franklin, let's hear from you next.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you all of the colleagues that are online. One of the things that I would like to maybe put in everyone's mind is that this is the conflict that is in the news today. There are other colleagues in other parts of the world that are also facing challenges. We've heard colleagues from Nicaragua being displaced to Costa Rica. We know what happened in Venezuela with displacement to Colombia. We know what happened to the Afghans and some that are still trapped. Many, unfortunately, do not make the news. Many do not, maybe the size of the scientific community is not large enough to mount this level of effort. But there's a need also to help support those colleagues and make sure that they remain connected to the scientific community. If you know of colleagues that are at risk, displaced, please do reach out to us. We are trying to set up seeds so that we can have a longer term mechanism to help support those colleagues that may be at need. Every situation is different from what we learned with our Afghanistan effort and what we're doing to help our colleagues in Ukraine. There's always a need to have information, ideas, connections. So if you have any of those for this particular situation or any situation in the future, we always welcome your thoughts, ideas, and suggestions. Thank you, Marcia. Back to you.
Thank you, Franklin. And there's a late breaking question that came in. So Vaughan, maybe in your closing remarks, you could address it.
Sure.
The question is, it's from Dr. Ramirez, and he's saying, what should one do with young Ukrainian male scholars seeking an invitation in order to be allowed to leave the country? That's a pretty tricky one.
There's the old axiom: never answer the phone after 5 p.m. on a Friday. Never take the late breaking question, because it's always a tricky one. That is a very tricky one. I think that there are, to earlier points, there may be ways to engage those scientists without necessarily promising them movement out of Ukraine. I think that may be the better path right now, which is to, if they're in that range of the 18 to 65, really seeing how to develop some sort of a remote collaboration first, as a way to maybe do some training in that space, recognizing that that's not maybe what they're looking for, but it gets us away from having to view it as science as a way to get the special dispensation to leave. I think that's
and also giving the impression that the U.S. is actually working against the Ukrainian government in terms of trying to protect their homeland.
Exactly right. So I'll just finish then very quickly by saying, that right now is going to be a time where obviously the immediate is going to be where we are and where we're focused. But again, that there are opportunities now to really start thinking about how to build those collaborations that over the long term can help rethink and rebuild a lot of the scientific sort of infrastructure in a country that's going to, without that scientific infrastructure, not be able to produce the amount of food that it produces, that not only feeds Ukraine, but literally, as we're seeing, is having implications for the world. I mean, the implications of Ukrainian research capacity going down in agriculture will have implications for not just Ukraine's economic viability, but truly the world's ability to handle some of the global food supply issues. The discussion earlier around biopharmaceuticals. I mean, these are all places where there's a research and industry connection. And so how we get the right people to talk about this, I know that, Marcia, when you go to the region, you're going to have an opportunity to meet with some Ukrainians to think through where can the academies best be situated. And I'll finish by saying the academies are actually, I believe, and having worked in government, uniquely positioned right now to work on this topic. Uniquely positioned because there is, as you're seeing here, but also throughout other parts of the academies, including our membership, tremendous expertise and knowledge that can be brought to bear. And for a U.S. government that is strained with so many other priorities and other needs, in many ways, the academies are where a lot of people are looking to help mobilize, but also mobilize our global networks, as has been alluded to help in this space. So I actually view this as being not only important, but actually necessary for the academies to be front and center in convening the U.S. U.S. scientific community, as well as the global scientific community, to think through what next steps are.
Yeah. So I just want to say in closing, I hope everyone listening to this understands that our goals here are to, first of all, prevent a brain drain from the Ukraine. That would be the worst possible outcome because it would make it so difficult to rebuild the country and rebuild its scientific workforce if different institutes come in and start cherry picking the best and the brightest of Ukrainian science. The other thing we want to do is help these researchers maintain their dignity. There's a huge difference between being a visiting scientist at a foreign lab and being a refugee. So anyway, I want to thank everyone in the audience who's listened to this today and thank the three panelists, Rita, Franklin, Vaughan, for your, not just this webinar, but especially for the hard work and long hours you have put in to doing something that's really meaningful and the right thing to do. So thanks very much. Thanks to everyone.